Welcome to On the Mark with Peter Buckley and Mark O'Donnell. Our podcast is dedicated to helping Christians target the right priorities in their apostolic and interior lives.
Well, welcome back once again to On the Mark. I'm Peter Buckley, and I'm here to introduce, as always, Mark O'Donnell. Mark, I want to thank you once again for joining us and sharing your insight, wisdom, and lately a lot of very helpful anecdotes.
I'm happy to be here. No, it's great. I'm glad we have a chance to talk about these topics because they're critical.
So on the last podcast, I guess we're going to continue a little bit from what we had talked about in our last episode, and that dealt mainly with a theme that we've been focusing on, which is evangelizing the workplace. And that the most recent episode was more of a focus on kind of early on in somebody's career, recently out of college. And you shared with us and you discussed your first job right out of school was down in New York at Manufacturers Hanover. I started in New York and then ultimately back here in Boston, up in Boston. And you described it as a little bit of a difficult start. And I think part of the issue there with you is you, with all very good intention and a great deal of excitement, thought you could evangelize in the workplace, but you approached it with maybe more of an academic approach than perhaps you should have employed. And then I think a couple of difficult situations kind of slapped you in the face, and you said, well, let's get a little more realistic in the approach to really trying to meet people where they are, answer their questions, instead of just trying to, proselytize and spouting doctrinal, truths to them. And I think that's probably, it's a good lesson you learned, and it's very important. We're grateful that you shared those very specific stories with us. I think now maybe let's advance a little further, continue the theme. Again, we're going to evangelize in the workplace, but now we're kind of moving up in our career a little bit and moving up the corporate ladder. In your case, you, after Manufacturers Hanover, you took a little time out in the corporate world and you went to MIT, Sloan School of Business, and you earned your MBA. And I think I'm remembering 1.5 years instead of the, normal 2 years. And right out of there, you joined General Cinema Corporation in Chestnut Hill. So maybe just, tell us about that experience.
No, I'll be happy to. Yeah, I mean, basically, when I was at Manufacturers Hanover, I met a colleague named Don, and he knew of a company called General Cinema. And so I had already decided I wanted to go back to get my MBA, and I got into MIT. And so I was headed there. But, once you get there, it's kind of, okay, well, what's your summer job going to be? And so I started thinking about that, and he put the bug in my ear to look up this company, General Cinema. So I started doing that. But just to get back to your point that you made in the preface there about, not being formulaic in our evangelization, I do have one anecdote from MIT, which I think is relevant. And that is, when I was there, every year Opus Dei has this Mass for St. Josemaria on June 26th to celebrate his passage into heaven. And it's a big deal. We print up invitations and we go out and invite many people to come and so forth. And so we had done that, at the center, and I had a bunch of invitations. And I remember, giving them to some of my classmates at MIT to see if they'd want to come. And there's one fellow student in particular, his name was Gus. He was from Mexico. And he said, oh, thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, he took the invitation. I thought, well, maybe he'll come. And then a couple of days later, he came up to me and he said, hey, Mark, can I speak with you? And I said, sure. He said, look, I want to give this invitation back to you. I said, oh, what? Why? He says, well, I don't go to church. I haven't gone to church in years, and I'm not going to go to the Mass. So maybe you can save it for somebody who will actually go. And it was very interesting to me, just the candor, but also B, just the fact that I hadn't even thought about that. Right. I just kind of gone out and said, well, here's a warm body. Here's somebody who's, in my class. I really didn't know much about him, other than that he was Mexican. So I just assumed he was practicing and so forth. But I learned from that you have to start by listening. You don't start by just pushing your agenda forward. And that was a real life example. But in any event, when I was at MIT, I started doing due diligence on cinema, and I managed to land an internship there for the summer in between my first and second year. And during that time, they asked me to look at the chocolate industry and a particular company that First Boston was selling called Ludens. They make Ludens cough drops, and the Fifth Avenue candy bar. It was about an $80 million company at the time, and they were trying to sell it. So part of my job was to look at the industry, find out, is it a good industry? Should we invest in it? Is this a good company to buy? And in that process, doing all this kind of due diligence, I uncovered a company called Cadbury Schweppes, which also owns some American brands, Junior Mints, Almond Joy, Mounds, York Peppermint Patty. So those are top 10 brands, but they're not top 5. Top 5 are Hershey's and Mars, right? So I went back to senior management and said, hey, look, this is an interesting company, Cadbury Schweppes, and they own these brands, and they're having a hard time right now. The stock's depressed. And so basically, we started buying stock. We ended up buying like 18% of the company. And that got me a job there. And so I went back and finished up a semester early at MIT because I already had a job waiting for me. But I think one of the things that I really learned from that experience was that if you're competent, right, if you're good at what you do and people see that, it opens up doors for them to speak with you or listen to you, or at least have an interest in who you are. So I didn't speak with a lot of my colleagues directly because I was like 30 years younger than they were at cinema, about the faith and so forth. But I told them where I lived. I told them what I was doing with the work and so forth. And they kind of were perplexed by it. But they kind of looked at it as, well, he'll probably grow out of that. Eventually you'll just meet a nice girl, you'll get married, you'll settle down. This idealism will get broken out of you. So that was a start. And then once I got there, a number of opportunities manifested themselves when I was there full time.
That's really important, I think, what you just shared. It's what you demonstrated with that story is that it really is important to demonstrate that you can compete and really add value to an organization and to really be a player. I mean, here you are, a young guy. I mean, and based on your insight and your study, a major corporation starts to buy 18% of another company. That's a big deal. And so that's important, of course, so it gives you a podium in a certain sense, but also I think what part of that story is showing us, you were revealing who you are, in terms of, they knew who you are, they knew where you lived, many knew your faith was a central part of your life, and let that be known. And then let your colleagues draw whatever conclusion they like. I think that's really important. I mean, anything else from your General Cinema day that seems to, in my knowing you, Mark, that's a very important part of your corporate career?
Yeah, one of the things that was interesting for me is my job was I was director of corporate finance, and so I had to raise money from banks and insurance companies to fund the operations. And we were about $1 billion company. We had a big beverage business. We were the biggest independent bottlers of Pepsi at the time, and we had a big theater business, although it wasn't as big as the bottling business. But anyway, I would go to New York and visit with investment banks. And one of the banks I visited with was Lehman Brothers. And there was a managing director there. His name was Dave. And, these banks like to wine you and dine you to get your business and so forth. And so, he would do that. I tell him I'm going to New York, and he'd say, well, look, we should have dinner, blah, blah, blah. So we would start to meet periodically. And in that process, he asked me about my life and what I was doing outside of work. And I told him about Opus Dei. And and how we try to sanctify our work and become saints in the ordinary. And he looked at me, he just shook his head, and he said, "How do you sanctify what you're doing?" You know, and it was good. And I said, "Well, I offer it to God, and I try to be honest and thorough and good at what I do." And he said, "Okay, that's kind of interesting." So after that conversation, I sent him a copy of The Way, right, the book by Saint Josemaria. And so the next time we got together, he mentioned to me, he said, I got the copy of The Way at the office, and all the guys on the trading floor were asking me what it was. And so I was telling them about you and about what it was and about what you're doing. And they said, Dave, you got to be careful. You're taking this relationship thing too far here. You're getting too deep into someone's life here, buddy. Just get the deal, sign up the deal. But in any event, it turns out that I did do a private placement with Lehman. It was $50 million. It was one of the best deals I've ever done. And it came out of that relationship with Dave. And that relationship was mixed with, personal stuff, business stuff, the whole gamut of life was there, because it turns out Dave's wife got breast cancer. And I told him I'd pray for him and her. And he said, "Mark, you can't believe how many people are praying for us. I really appreciate it." So there was this whole dynamic that unfolded through the job, right? Where I was able to help this guy who wasn't Catholic, but who we had a professional relationship with. So I think that was a very interesting one. And then also, I think, Peter, it's important because, we all know what happened to Lehman Brothers, right? The whole thing collapsed, right? It was just like a house of cards. I mean, there was all this systemic fraud inside of it, and it just went down. So it's not like you're going to go in and change Lehman Brothers, right? But you can go in and help people who are there. It's kind of like you're throwing lifelines to them, and to help them. And I think that's really important because we often look at the institutional, and we often say, "Oh, we have to put," like in Opus Dei, we talk about putting Christ at the summit of all human activity. Well, that doesn't mean, Lehman Brothers is going to start worshiping Christ or put crucifixes in the offices and anything like that. It just means that we have to live our lives according to Christ and with Christ, and then help others do that individually, even though they may be in situations that are not all that attractive from a moral perspective.
Yeah, I was in DC last week for a conference, and one of the guys speaking was a very well-known guy on Wall Street, chief investment officer for a couple of major firms. Everybody would know their name. And this guy, I didn't really realize this until a couple of years ago. I worked with this guy going back, 10 or 15 years ago. But this guy, so this is your point of when you can demonstrate and manifest competence and professionalism, and you can attain a certain level of leadership, people are going to come to you, and they come to you, as you probably had in your experience with Dave. When they're coming to you as a leader, they're not always coming to you with, sharing great stories. A lot of times it's with problems and conflicts. And this guy, and anytime when anybody would come in to see this guy, he would say, regardless of who they were, he would, in a very genuine sense, this guy's a very solid believing Christian, he would tell them, "I'm going to pray for you." Mm-hmm. And he said, never did he have an incident or an occasion where any of these people who sought his guidance and help ever rejected that or were shocked by it. And in fact, most were appreciative and grateful for it. And then he said, if they were to come back a second time and discuss that same kind of, issue with them or problem with them, he would, on the spot, he'd say, "Can we pray now? Can I pray for you now?" And again, without any resistance. And so I think he was able to do that because of what you just, mentioned earlier, because he was known as a very competent, person, and very natural too. It's not, he's not beating anybody over the head. And so these relationships are important. And I think so having the competence, attaining level of, in many cases, leadership, as you had risen to, does give you an opportunity to affect, many people. So What happened with General Cinema? You didn't stay there for your whole career. So what happened?
Well, it's interesting. What I did is, I was there 5 years, and during that time, through the Cadbury investment, which we ultimately liquidated, and then through a sale of the beverage business, those are two transactions that I initiated when I was there, and they generated pre-tax profits of 600 million for the company. And when Dick Smith ended up selling the company a number of years later, he ended up with $1 billion, which he then doled out to various charities. So I like to think of myself as, contributing 40% of his $1 billion through my work, and he was giving money to hospitals and different Jewish charities and so forth. But I think that's another way to look at evangelization. Maybe you're not the front guy, but you're the back guy that enables the front guy to kind of do his job, or take the limelight, and that's fine, because the last will be first, the first will be last. We don't need to be first here. But so I left cinema because I wasn't part of the family, and it was pretty much a family business, and I wasn't going to get an operating role of any significance. And so one of the industries we had looked at when I was there was the supermarket business. So I started to look at food retail, and I became, quite interested in it. And then I looked at the convenience store business because I could afford to get into that. I couldn't afford to start a supermarket. I didn't have the money or experience to do that. So I got into the convenience store business, and I started that down in Rhode Island. I bought a store on Route 6 in Johnston, Rhode Island, and hired someone to come in and and run it for me. And that experience was very interesting to me because every day, once I got the store up and running, I had 300 to 400 people come in every day. And there were opportunities to talk to these people about different things, without sounding preachy at all, just trying to help them whatever way you could, And I remember this one anecdote, and I've shared it with you before, but I don't think I have with a larger group. And that was one day a woman came in and she bought some things and she left. And the next day I wasn't there. Steve, who was also he was also an Opus Dei. He was helping me out just part-time, for like 3 weeks. He helped me out. He was working. And so she comes in the next morning. I'm opening on Saturday, and she asks if he's around. And I said, no, he's not. Thinking, you want to buy something, what do you need? I want to kind of make some money, or I'm just thinking economically, right? And then she says, no, it's just that I came in yesterday and he was very helpful. And I said, oh, really? Again, thinking, what did he get you? What did he sell you? And then she just told me the story. She said, no, I yesterday I left my husband and I came up here. There's a hotel across the street. And I was all nervous because I did that. And I came over to the store and wanted to buy some toiletries because I didn't have time to take that with me, bring that with me. And he saw I was nervous and he asked me if I was all right. And I told him what happened. And then he said to me, well, why don't you just call him and let him know you're okay? And so I did that, and I feel much better and things are better. And I just wanted to come back and thank him for that. And here I'm listening to this, completely, not dumbfounded, but just impressed that simple way of trying to help somebody worked, So I think I could have done a lot more of that myself than I did. I didn't pray enough for those people as they came in the store. And you're young, you want to grow your business, you want to be successful. But as a result, you don't pick up on these nuances and small things, like simply to say, are you okay? I mean, if Steve hadn't noticed that, asked, how you doing? Are you all right? She wouldn't have then told him what the problem was, and he couldn't have offered some help. So I think that was a good example of evangelization in the convenience store business. Then there was also an Orthodox bishop who had a little parish down the road from one of my stores, and he would come in to buy cigarettes and different things. And we got to talking, and we started talking about the work, and he was like flabbergasted that I was in Opus Dei and I was running this convenience store. He says, well, here you are trying to make all this money and you're trying to be a saint. How does that work? And I was like, well, this is how it works. You're here, you're here. This is how it works. And we became pretty good friends. He died about 10 years ago, but he had a little parish and people, and he was a good man in his own right. And then there was another instance where I was trying to do a lot of business with Coca-Cola, and I did a lot of business with them. I was able, I had a little capital, so I was able to buy in bulk, so I could buy hundreds of cases of Coke and sell it really cheap. This is back when people drank a lot of soda. They still do drink quite a bit, but anyway. So unbeknownst to me, the driver was clipping me, 4 or 5 cases every time he delivered the 100 cases. So I really, most of my profit was going back to him. And so one day the district manager came in and he looks at me and he says, how are you doing? I said, good. And he said, is everything okay? And I said, yeah, I think. And he said, look, we just fired the driver for your route. We caught him stealing, and he was stealing from accounts. And did he steal from you? And I looked at him and I said, I have no effing clue if he did, but I feel pretty bad right now because I'm having a nightmare about all this work I've been doing, selling hundreds of cases of your product and realizing I'm not making much profit on this. And he looked at me with this look of compassion, like, hey, I'm sorry, don't worry about it. You're a little naive. He didn't say that, but just the look conveyed that. And he said, look, I'm going to give you 10 free cases now. And if you find out you're shorted more, just call me. I'll give you more product. And I really learned something from somebody, who was older, experienced, professional. It was a good, and it was just, I don't know how to describe it other than to say it was a good experience for me to go through that. I don't know.
So based on that experience and a few of the others that you've shared with me, if you had to do it over again, what would you have done differently with the convenience stores?
Well, I think what I would have done is if I had a deeper prayer life at the time, I would have prayed more for those people. I mean, a lot of them were regular customers too, but I didn't know their names. I just knew them by sight. And you kind of become a little bit of a public figure when you're running a store in a neighborhood. Because one day I was out pumping gas and someone was driving by and they start beeping the horn a lot. And I thought they were beeping at someone. And then they slow down and start beeping the horn right at me. And I'm looking at them like, what's going on? They roll the window down and they say, you're the guy at the store, right? Yeah. You remember, I go to the store. I just want to say hi. Oh, okay. You don't realize that the opportunity you have, because people are looking for some type of connection. And if they're coming in every day at 4 o'clock to get their milk and bread and eggs or whatever, you can actually form a connection with them. And I didn't realize that. So, and I could have taken better advantage of that. I could have prayed for them. And if you're praying for people, then I think they're more inclined to tell you what's on their mind, what's bothering them. And then you can offer some advice or some help, and that can help them, just like it helped that woman, at least in the short term.
So,
it can.
As we follow this path here, you're doing $600 million acquisitions in corporate America. You're running a convenience store in Route 6, Rhode Island. So what happened with the stores and where'd you go from there?
Basically, in a moment of weakness, I went back and had lunch with the former CFO of General Cinema, who had become the CEO of Boston Gas and a company called Eastern Enterprises, which owned Boston Gas. And I told him that, I told him I was thinking about going back into corporate. I'd been doing this a couple of years. And right on the spot, he said, come here, work here with me. and I'll put you in charge of development. And I said, well, let me think about, okay, I'll get a letter out to you tonight and call me tomorrow. Literally, this is what happened. So he gets the letter out to me, and it was like 90, 100 grand or something, which was at the time a good, a nice offer just to walk away. And so I took the offer and I sold the store to one of my customers and financed them so they could buy it. But I remember when I was leaving, one of my employees, a middle-aged woman, came up to me. She said, you can go and take the big corporate job and get paid nice money and so forth. But, you like this business and you're good at it and you're going to miss it. And she was 100% right.
She was right. Yeah.
It's just, so it's even with your employees, they can see, like sometimes my employees would come upon my spiritual reading under the counter, and they would look at it and read it. And then, weeks later, they would be like, what was that book you were reading a couple of weeks ago? And I wasn't even aware that they were doing that. But that's also just having the books there, Christ is passing by. I mean, I thought he died. So it's those kinds of conversations were happening.
Well, stay tuned this Sunday. You'll see what happened.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. But anyway, so I went back into corporate. I helped them for about a year, and you couldn't really do much, owning a utility. So I got somewhat frustrated, and I went to work for a British manufacturing company, about 1.5 billion in sales, like a mini BTR. Owned a bunch of automotive friction materials and corporate jet servicing businesses. And the CEO was pretty interesting guy, but he had this habit, like when we'd have these small management review meetings, he would call upon the different managers and he would say, George, your numbers aren't that good. Okay, we've got 4. He says, you're going to have to do penance for your sins. And he would, act like he was beating George. And I'm thinking, how am I ever going to help this guy or do anything good here, But opportunity came. He asked me to go to Malaysia to start up a manufacturing plant. I said, look, I can't go. He said, why not? I said, well, I belong to this group called Opus Dei, and I have about 10 or 12 married guys that I try to help out and meet with them regularly. And he looks at me and he's like, wow, does it take that much time that you have to be single to do that? And I didn't really know what to say other than, well, I don't really want to go to Bangkok. And then he said, that's okay. I mean, I'm glad someone's doing what you're doing. And I still remember that, and so hopefully I helped him somewhat, I don't know, but just being there, I think, is important.
We've all, in the previous episodes, we often refer back to scripture and the Gospels. And maybe you can direct us back to the Gospels and maybe provide us with a good role model for, somebody perhaps we can imitate as we try to really develop and improve this whole notion of evangelizing in the workplace.
Yeah, I mean, I think the best role model for us, right, as laymen, professional laymen, is St. Paul. He was a tent maker, which is considered a pretty menial job in those days. And he wasn't particularly proud about doing that, but he had to do it to make money, to support himself. But he also met Aquila and Priscilla through that work. They became co-workers. And we often miss this nuance of evangelization. We think St. Paul is the guy giving talks to huge crowds and giving speeches to scribes and Pharisees and appearing before kings and magistrates and all this stuff. And he did that. But he also had all sorts of different individual friendships. I mean, if you read Romans 16, okay, he mentions 36 people by name whom he wants to send greetings to, thank or convey greetings from, both men and women. So these are people that he's met through the course of his life and in a somewhat intimate way. So I would read his letters, meditate on them, focus on how naturally he forms friendships and relationships with people. And he obviously wasn't afraid to get out there and stir it up. We know that, but that's what evangelization is all about. And when we start doing that, I think the scales fall from our eyes and we realize the need for it and how important it is. And then as a result, how important our lives are. That I think is the real, eye opener, is that we realize that that's right. Your role is super important because you're going to be reaching people no one else reached. And you're going to be reaching them in a way that you can accompany them because you're going to be working with them. So you don't have to hit the ball out of the park every time, but you'll have plenty of chances to swing at the pitch. Whereas if you're doing something like this podcast, sure, we can help people who listen to it and hopefully encourage them, but we can't do that nearly as well as if we were working with them, every day. So that's what that's what I would say.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thanks as always, Mark. And, thank you not just for taking the time in the podcast, but also sharing some very personal stories with us. I know just from feedback I get from people, they really are grateful for it. So I am as well. So thank you.
Definitely. No, anything I can do to help people, I want to help them. And I didn't realize that at the time when I was working at these different places, how great the opportunity was. So if there's a way that we can help people to quickly turn on this light and turn on the switch and begin this process, we're right where they are.
I didn't realize over these many years when we're recording during Holy Week, Tuesday of Holy Week, and I didn't realize this, Mark, that you were the one that I was cursing every Holy Saturday. I'm the father of 6 kids, and every Holy Saturday I'm laying out little trails of little Cadbury Schweppes eggs.
Oh, okay.
For my kids. I was the Easter bunny, and I'm cursing these little eggs. And who knew that you were involved with that?
That's right. I was.
My youngest is now a sophomore in college, so those days are beyond me, thankfully. Yes. So we'll have to bring it full circle. So we want to wish everybody a happy Easter, and I want to thank you once again for taking the time. And we will see everybody on our next episode of On the Mark.
Great. Thanks, Peter.
Thanks for listening to On the Mark with Peter Buckley and Mark O'Donnell. If you enjoy our podcast, be sure to follow us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify to be notified every time Peter and Mark release a new episode. And visit us on the web at onthemark.show.